We're here to make America stream again, Dan. 1 in 3 streams on planet Earth are American artist streams. Nobody even comes close to that figure. A, no market is as lucrative as America, and B, no market exports like America.
So if you brought yourself back to where you were when you were working at Spotify, did you expect it to play out this way?
Not at all. It's a straight TKO to the jaw. Mexico has overtaken Canada as the biggest importer of streams into the United States. And pretty soon it's going to overtake the United Kingdom as well. The British invasion is going to be overtaken by the Mexican invasion. So that tells you a lot about how the American market domestically is changing.
Such a strong saturation of the US streaming market.
I think one thing America has, which no one else has in terms of generating value for music, is an ad sales market like no other.
As you and I always do, we're looking at the future. Where does this look in 2030?
You would expect over the next 5, 7, 10 years that the emerging market is going to squeeze America's share of the global business. That doesn't mean America suffers. It's not at the expense of America. It just means it will feel a bit more marginalized in its overall sphere of influence.
We've talked a lot on this show about how artists all across the world have been able to have their voices heard and build sustainable careers in the streaming era. Look at K-pop, Latin hip-hop, Afrobeats, and more. These artists and their fans have been able to reach each other without relying on the traditional gatekeepers or the Western-based artists that have dominated airwaves for years. But what if I told you that in the same time span, the US-based artists have become more dominant than ever? In 2011, US artists accounted for 27% of the global recorded music business revenue. In 2024, that number increased to 38%. Last year, 2 out of every 3 streams in the US was for a US-based artist. And globally, 1 out of every 3 streams is for a US artist. So, American music is a massive domestic business and still a massive export business. So how do we make sense of these two trends when lower entry barriers have made it possible for all artists around the world to build a career, but the most dominant country is more dominant than ever? That's what we're going to talk about in this episode. We're joined by our friend of the pod, Will Page. He's a former chief economist at Spotify, the author of Pivot, and loves digging into topics just like this. So you'll hear us get into why. Why is it that this dynamic exists? Where do we expect things to go in the future? And what are the things that we can pinpoint that will answer this question? We talk about countries like France, Canada, and Mexico, and what their import-export business looks like and how reliant they are on US music. But then we'll also talk about quotas, tariffs, and how this particular topic sits within the broader trade war discussions that the United States has had for the past few months. So I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Let's dive in. All right, we're here to talk about streaming in America with a non-American, but a friend of the pod, Will Page. Welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
It has. It's been a minute, and we're here to make America stream again, Dan.
You digging into why Americans stream American. Did the Vance administration and Trump, did they reach out to you and find out how many streams Bad Bunny gets in the US? And they said, okay, we got to dig into this.
They're stealing our streams. No, they did not. But it's timely. You know, I'm always interested in how music trades. We discussed that last time round. How music travels across borders, playlists without borders, which is how I call it. It was just timely to take a look at the value of the American music industry and just see how it does at home, but also how well it does overseas. So this is a missing piece of a big puzzle.
What sparked this for me was seeing the tweet or the Truth Social post from Trump about the reciprocal tariff on movies. And I remember seeing that and my mind immediately went to music.
It did. And let's go to the eyes before we turn to the ears and take care of movies for a second. And forgive me before I go down my own little rabbit hole here, but you know, due to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, which is what allows for this whole tariff war in the first place, there's a carve-out for the audiovisual section. So when he announced those tariffs on films, it's interesting to know that there was a law which he is using, which means he can't apply it to the Netflix of this world. So in many ways, the new world of cinema is actually immune from this. I don't know whether he read that memo, but he can hear it on Trapital if he's listening.
And the other key difference with music as opposed to movies is that in movies, a lot of the decisions are much more top-down, whether it's the Chinese government deciding, no, we don't want Marvel movies coming here anymore, but we'll accept Avatar. In music, though, while there are still a lot of top-down forces that influence this, which we'll get to, a lot of it is more so bottom-up. These are the users themselves choosing to stream particular types of music, which have set the dynamic that we're now in.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that we've empowered the consumer. So governments then say we have to regulate the platforms, which is back to front. Previously, the platforms were the gatekeepers and they looked at the consumer. And we'll come to the question of quotas in a second, but it's just interesting to think that in our world, there is no gatekeeper, the consumer decides. And that raises a very interesting dilemma for the policymakers out there.
And I think the key stat that stuck out to me with the report is the percentage that the United States is actually accounting for is much bigger. You would have thought we've heard so much about different artists from different countries having their opportunity, which they do, but the US has also increased quite a bit.
You're right. If we went back to when Spotify launched in 2011, the music industry was just about $16 billion. That was it. And of that global recorded industry, about a quarter of it came from the United States. Now we roll forward to last year, we're talking about a business, for the sake of round numbers, of 30 billion, and just short of 40% of it is from the United States. That is a 40% bigger share of an 80% bigger pie. Now, time out. This is not what theory would have predicted. You go back to your economics textbooks, as the world becomes more globalized, the share of the big established markets will fall and the growth of the emerging markets will rise. Interesting tidbit for you. The GDP of India this year is going to overtake Japan. That's what globalization is supposed to produce. Not so in the music industry. In the music industry, the market leader has broken away from the pack and become a much bigger part of a much bigger business, contrary to what theory would have predicted. Two lanes that we have to straddle in this conversation: the value of the American music market in a global context, but the value of American music in a global context. The first is a domestic focus. The second is going to be an export focus. With the help of Luminate, and a shout out to Scott Ryan, to Jane, to Mary, and the whole team at Luminate, of all the streams that happened on planet Earth, how many were American? And the answer is a third. 1 in 3 streams on planet Earth are American artist streams. Nobody even comes close to that figure. I think India is in second place with an eighth, and it's low value streams, probably on YouTube. But in terms of where the money is at and where the action is at, A, no market is as lucrative as America, and B, no market exports like America. And the facts to back that point up.
I know that you said this wasn't supposed to happen and play out this way for the US, but you've been in this. If you brought yourself back to where you were when you were working at Spotify, did you expect it to play out this way?
Not at all. It's a straight TKO to the jaw. You go back to thinking about India overtaking Japan in economic terms. India is not going to overtake Japan in music terms. And there are very deep-seated reasons why that's going to happen. And then you start to think about divergence in terms of the macroeconomic outlook, GDP per capita, for want of a better word. And then you can think about the outlook in terms of music industry revenues, where per streams are still incredibly low in the emerging markets, where price rises are happening in established markets. And that gap that we're discussing here, that winner-takes-all visualization that we have in our heads, could expand further. So yeah, this is not what theory would have predicted, but at Trapital we deal with the facts.
You also look at the rise of Latin music. You and I have talked about glocalization. These things are all happening, but it's also all happening while the US has continued to get stronger.
I ask you to go to the YouTube artist charts for Brazil. It's a brilliant site. Google it up and pull down those top 100 artists in Brazil this week. And you'll find 1, maybe 2 international artists on that chart is singing in Portuguese. Very little Spanish. And if you're lucky, I think The Weeknd is ranked 95 and Bruno Mars is ranked 65. You've got 2 imposters in there. Other than that, it's an entirely Portuguese chart. So there you go. There's a top 10 global music market that's just said thank you and good night to the English language. If you are a non-English speaking country with a strong identity, globalization is a force for good. If, however, you are an English speaking country that's not American, globalization leaves you screwed. So we have winners and we have losers. Then we come back to America, where I'm going to call it the confuser, because here it's a mixed bag. And it was interesting in the Global Value of Copyright report to flag that Mexico is overtaking Canada as the biggest importer of streams into the United States. And pretty soon it's going to overtake the United Kingdom as well. The British invasion is going to be overtaken by the Mexican invasion. So that tells you a lot about how the American market domestically is changing. It has a very culturally diverse population, and that's showing in the culturally diverse streaming habits. Double down on that Latin observation, Colombia. The most incredible achievement of that work was to show that Colombian artists are getting more value of streams from the rich United States than their own entire country is worth. American streams are worth more than the Colombian music industry. That tells you a lot about trade. America is worth more to them than they are worth to themselves. And that's massive as well. We looked at all the countries that Luminate covers, 60 plus countries. And in over half of them, 35 of them, America was the number one streamed artist nationality in those countries. So you can see at home, it's confusing, but it's good. The business is booming. It makes up almost 40% of the global business. It's never had such a bigger share of a bigger pie in its history. But abroad, it's booming too. To be quite clear, for the American recorded music industry, it's boom time.
So let's tease out that loser group a bit more. If you're an English-speaking artist, but you're not American, why is that group a loser, and what's an example of that?
It gets sensitive. If you look at New Zealand, Australia, Britain, and Canada, the Commonwealth Club, we could call them, across all four countries, concerns being expressed about the success of the domestic music market. Now we know, and it's broadly accepted, that our country used to pour out global pop stars every year. And I have argued convincingly that we haven't produced a true global pop star, a true stadium-filling global pop star, since Dua Lipa in 2017.
You're not feeling Pink Panther-esque?
Not on my Spotify Wrapped, no. But then you have to look at how bad is it? And I'll release one stat on Trapital, which is quite shocking. In the first 5 calendar years of this decade, we've managed to get 30 artists into our top 1,000 in our home country. 30. That's it. And they're all ranked around 750, 600, 500. None are top 100. So we've had a really visible drought in this country in terms of getting talent in there. Now, there is signs of hope. Lola Young's Messi is getting played in every restaurant and retail establishment across Europe just now. I don't know how it's working in America. I heard it in Atlanta. And we have Miles Smith. We have the Ezra Collective, which for my music, jazz, rap, and soul is one of the most exciting projects. But do we see the momentum that says they're going to climb to the top of the mountaintop? Jury out. What we know is that North America, that is United States, Canada, and Barbados, there's very one important Barbadian that we have to consider here, is dominating the British charts. So there you have a kind of reverse of the trade dispute that Trump is talking about, in that America dominates the rest of the world. For the English-speaking markets that are not American, that's become a problem.
The other thing to dig into here is potential genre implications, because we know that it's one thing to look at US music, but it's not a monolith. Different genres play differently. Pop tends to be much more international, as opposed to hip hop and country music, relatively speaking, do tend to be a bit more US centric than others. So what's your take on genre implications and whether or not there's a deeper story there that may be driving the larger number?
And firstly, with hip hop, I think the best example of glocalization is to look at how hip hop travels. I think it was Anna Gruszka, who is a brilliant brain now at YouTube, who pointed out in the regional paper that 34 of the top 40 artists in their home country of Poland were Polish. They were all doing hip hop, but they were rapping in Polish. Right there, you've got the genre is global. Hip hop comes from the boogie down Bronx. It doesn't come from Warsaw, but the language is local, hence the word glocalization. So the fact that hip-hop has been the first mover in seeing local artists get to the top of local charts tells you a lot about it. And I said this before in Trapital, let's remind ourselves what Chris Wong told us: rap is something you do, hip-hop is something you live. The culture of hip-hop is crossing borders. The language of hip-hop is local within those borders. So that's a very important observation about rap music.
One of the things that stuck out to me with Luminate's data, they had their end of the year report, and Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us was the number 2 most streamed song in the US. But if you look at the global charts, it wasn't even in the top 10. I look at a song like Espresso that had pretty similar numbers of streams to Not Like Us in the US. But when you look at it on a global perspective, Espresso gets a ton more. Not Like Us felt so monocultural to me and a lot of us living in the US. But on a global perspective, the streams just didn't register in that type of way.
That's a deep observation, Dan. Thank you for that. The culture crosses those borders. The language it wants to be received in is chosen to be local. Now, that was a first mover, but we're also seeing that across all the genres now. But hip-hop, as we know from history, always seems to move first. So that's a really, really important thing to dig into. If I can flip it back to just country music real quickly, of all those genres out there, country is fascinating because country is changing in America. Thanks to the efforts of Beyonce and a handful of others, we're really seeing the perception of country change, the fan base of country change. Let's remember it was a late adopter of streaming. Country was the last to let go of the CD and the download format and embrace streaming. So we're seeing the transition, but we're seeing it transition into something very new from where it left off. It's almost like Tarzan economics, letting go of the old vine and they're reaching out to the new. But not like hip hop. In hip hop, the genre travels, but the artists don't. In country, the genre is traveling and the artists are traveling with it. So one of the biggest genres growing in Australia right now is country, but I don't see, Keith Urban aside, a lot of Australian country artists. They're American country artists. In the UK, we're seeing something similar, but I don't see British country artists. I see American country artists. So you've kind of got two lanes here, and that allows you to revisit this concept of trade with a fresh lens.
I also wonder if one of the underlying factors here, there has been such a strong saturation of the US streaming market, not just from a percentage of people that are subscribing to these paid services, but also the price difference of those services compared to other countries where not only does it cost less, but a lower percentage of the people in those countries are paying for services, or if not, they're maybe using an ad-supported service. So the combination of those two things, if you're comparing to how things were in the 2000s, is that difference bigger than it ever was?
On one hand, I think you could be right, but not for the reasons you prescribe. I think one thing America has, which no one else has in terms of generating value for music, is an ad sales market like no other. If you take a look at Pandora, if you take a look at Sound Exchange, that's an American creation with American ad dollars, and nobody else comes close. If you take a look at the podcast market, the vast majority of podcast ad dollars are American ad dollars. Over here in Europe, we're rubbing coins together to try and make them breed. But America, you're actually making some serious cabbage from your ad market. So that's important. If I just do the maths in my head, I think of the global sync market for record labels, over 2/3 of that comes from the United States. And a lot of that is going to be advertising as well. So on one side, in terms of where the value is, why the United States? Why does America become so great again? Then I think the ad spend could be a contributing factor. Now, to contradict myself, on the other hand, I would argue that America gets streaming pretty cheap. If you think about $9.99, it's not $9.99 sterling. So we would look at you guys getting it relatively cheap. You're a lot wealthier than us Brits, but you're getting Spotify for a lot cheaper than us. And another tiny little bit, which will interest some of your audience, is to remember VAT. It exists here in Europe. It doesn't exist in America. So before you get to your license base, we wipe 20% off the top. The tax man gets more than the artist or the songwriter. Whereas in America, I'm licensing the $9.99 up front with no deductions. I don't necessarily think the price in America is particularly expensive or lucrative. I think there's work to be done on pricing. We have debated that one to death. Thank you, Trapital. But I do think the ad market is a huge contributing factor to why America has had this phenomenal run and dominates the global picture the way that it does.
That's a very good point. Another point worth exploring, the Western-centric US recorded music business, especially now that there's been so much more consolidation in the past 15 years, them owning the music, them owning the business, and them driving the business forward, has this also led to a concentration of Americans driving the business more than ever?
This wouldn't necessarily affect the domestic value of the American business because that's their backyard. What we're discussing here is why are they making such a huge share of the overall industry? But equally, those are international companies making money from other markets. And I think one thing that we've seen, and it supports a view of localization, is a lot more devolution from these international companies, giving more power to their office in Miami, giving more power to their offices in Berlin, and devolving power down to those. So I think that's really important. But I think the question that arises from the way you framed it, Dan, is the organizational charts. How should these organizations design themselves, given these global imbalances that we're dealing with, given this unpronounceable word glocalization, which is now part of the media lexicon? If I run Canada and you run America, or if I run UK and you run France, do we meet once a year at an offsite? And is that it? Our consumers don't behave like that. Our consumers don't see those borders. But if you're running the French office and I'm running the British office, why should you pick up the phone to me to promote my British acts in your country when the French market is dominated by French acts? The French language is dominant, so why don't you stick with your own? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, as we say. If you promote my British acts as well, is that at the expense of your domestic market, or is that in addition to your domestic market success? Those questions remain unanswered. So there's a lot of work to be done on the org charts of these companies to make sure they're equipped for this new trading landscape that we're dealing with now.
Because on one hand, you can say that you are finding new listeners that may not otherwise be listening to music, and that is growing the pie. On the other hand, you can say it's a zero-sum game. You can only listen to one artist at one time. So anytime that you're listening to artist A that is French, you are not listening to artist B that is American.
And the way to navigate that is not top down. It's not the boss sending a diktat to his company saying, here's how we're going to restructure the organization. It's street level, bottom up entrepreneurship. I mean, let's go back to the most incredible story from the global valley of copyright, the success of those Punjabi Canadians, not just in Canada, where the second most streamed language in Canada is not French, not Spanish, but now it's Punjabi. It's not just a Canadian story. It's an Indian story. The Punjabi Canadian industry has supported Punjabi Canadian artists on the outskirts of Toronto to go and break Mumbai. And that's bottom up. That's street smart. Now, where does that take you? What did we learn last week? Hybe, the K-pop label based in Korea, is now looking at investing in India. So what do you think is going to happen there? And this is the new school. We can talk about the old yearbooks and the old stats, but let's go where the game is. The game is getting across borders where other people can't.
And speaking of the French market, because we're talking a little bit about them, countries like Canada, France, South Korea, there's tariffs, there are quotas that do already exist in these countries. These markets rely heavily on the US music. But what do you think would happen if there was to be some type of tariff or quota that these countries decided to place and it went through one of the streaming services or one of the short form video platforms?
Well, a big shout out to all the Canadian listeners of Trapital, of which you have hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of, because it's huge up there. Every time I go on, all the Canadians are like, we'll listen to you on Trapital. So you're crossing that border. But yeah, I don't want to upset anyone with my Canadian friends here, but I want to take you through a bit of maths on this work. I worked out, again, with the help of the great team at Luminate here, what is the value of Canadian artist streams inside the US? Think imports here. Of all those Canadian artists, The Weeknd, Drake, Avril Lavigne, Tragically Hip, all those incredible bands being streamed inside America, how much millions of dollars did they get? We know the Colombian story. We know the Mexican story. We've published that. What did the Canadians receive? It's about $300 million worth of streams. Over $250 million, US dollars, went from America to Canada. What's the value of the Canadian stream market? Somewhere between $500 and $600 million. Okay, so then you have to remember that in Canada, only 1 in 10 streams in Canada goes to Canadian artists. So if I keep it really simple here, if it's $500 million and it's 1 in 10, that means if a $500 million Canadian business, $50 million went to Canadian artists. So what that means is Canadian artists are seeing $50 million from their home country, but $300 million from their £900 gorilla south of the border. So the American market is worth 6 times as much as their own country when it's viewed from a Canadian artist perspective. And that is a beautiful example of a trade balance. Do you need me more than I need you? Who's the price taker and who's the price maker in this relationship? And that's the beauty of this work, is now, thanks to the fantastic advancement in data from Luminate, we can do this type of analysis and see trade flows, see imports and exports across borders. But then you get to grips with what's underpinning this trade war. Donald Trump saying, I don't see Germans driving American cars. We drive lots of German cars. That's a trade imbalance, for better or for worse. For me, I think it's irrelevant. It's cars. But it makes you think about imports and exports differently.
This also made me think live music is a whole nother example of this, but some of these numbers are starting to reflect this because Polestar has shown data that around 45% of their global concert business is based in the United States. And that's not too far off from the 38% number that you had shared.
Wow, that is eerily similar.
I know, is one starting to reflect the other? And are the dynamics of streaming the way that it exists today starting to mirror this a bit?
And if we looked at who's filling the stadiums and festivals around the rest of the world, I'm not sure we're going to be seeing local acts getting to that status. I think we're going to be looking at the American acts, the Taylor Swift tour last year, the Beyonce tour this year, which are making those stadiums and festivals do their business. What makes Trapital such a valuable podcast is you can explore in real time these topics and see so much more. There was an article in the Economist publication from about 5 or 6 months ago called The Envy of the World. And I worked on this article looking at the American economy. And it just made a very obvious point, which is since 2000, the US economy, from a capitalist perspective, we're not looking at culture here, let's switch lanes from culture to capital. From a capitalist perspective, it's leaving the rest of the world for dust. Dan, there are 3 US companies now with 3 CEOs, Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia, whose market cap is greater than the UK capitalist system. Serious. There could be a 4th or 5th pretty soon. JP Morgan is talking about becoming the first $1 trillion bank in the world. If you add up the Mag 7's total capital value, I think that's bigger than the UK, European, and Japanese stock markets combined. What you see in music, America compared to 2011 is seeing a 40% increase in an 80% bigger pie. It's dominating the global market as opposed to shrinking, contrary to what theory would have predicted. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and we need to discuss it more.
And on this note, too, what you just said reminded me of foreign exchange and whether or not that's played a factor in this. Of course, the U.S. has had high inflation recently. But on the other hand, some of these other countries that we've been talking about and their relationship with the U.S., their currency has gotten weaker. What's your take on that?
If you want to send your audience to sleep, let's spend 20 minutes on foreign exchange markets. But
Okay, the high level.
I would say, like, whenever you look at these numbers and your audience is inquisitive, they want to get into the meat of the detail. A lot of these global figures are expressed in US constant currency, which gives you consistency but hides the volatility. So the Japanese yen, for example, is a very volatile country against America. So you can be up one year and down the next year and have all of those movements cancelled out because you're using a fixed exchange rate as opposed to a fluctuating one. So it's the least worst of all the alternatives is to present all this stuff in a US constant currency. So you're right, it's an issue. But remember, when we look at the data, we often hide that issue by the methodology we deploy.
So we've talked a lot about how we got from 2011 to where we are today. But as you and I always do, we're looking at the future. Where does this look in 2030? Given all the factors that we discussed, what do you predict?
Well, Harry Truman is going to hate me because I'm going to say on one hand this, on the other hand that. But on one hand, as theory should predict, I mean, if India's GDP is overtaking Japan's this year, you would expect over the next 5, 7, 10 years that the emerging market heft of India and of China, of Latin America especially, is going to squeeze America's share of the global business. These are apples and pears. It doesn't mean America stops growing. It just means when we look at a $40 billion business, America won't be making up 40% of it anymore. That doesn't mean America suffers. It's not at the expense of America. It just means it will feel a bit more marginalized in its overall sphere of influence, you could argue. That's theory. Let's just go back to the 2010s and the creation of Sound Exchange. I mentioned this earlier. That was an American creation that hasn't been replicated by anywhere else in the world. That's $1 billion, for the sake of round numbers, that nobody else gets to see. We could argue displacement, but generally speaking, that's a big piece of the pie. If the music industry is 30, then one of that 30 goes to America and cannot be found anywhere else. No one else has a Pandora, a Sirius XM business like America has. It's uncomparable. So I'd ask the audience to think about what, over the next 3, 5, 7 years, can America produce again that no one has? And that could be a revolution in the sync market. What upholds the American music industry, copyright, is very important, and it's produced one of the greatest trading assets I think the economy has.
Well, we will definitely be following along. Thank you to Will Page, who is joining us from Talliard Studios. You got a beautiful layout there behind you.
Yeah, and to stress to every one of your international audience from all corners of the world, man, your audience is really worldwide. If you're in London, you can find behind King's Cross, where Universal and Sony's headquarters are. We're a campus of 300 creative industries, from SoundCloud to Apple. How else can I sell it? We also have a brewery and a beer garden. I'm not sure if that gets us across the line and into the end zone here. But yeah, a very welcoming community of creative people that we love visitors. So to stress to Trapital, make yourself home at Talliard if you're ever in the city.
And before we close things out, Will, give the audience something to listen to, because I know you always put out your annual mix, so we can link to it in the show notes, but tell them what they should expect.
What you can expect is an introduction from none other than Ice-T. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say Ice MFT. I'm not sure if that's the Christian middle name there, but yeah, to have the iceberg, one of my heroes. To this day, I can still recite the lyrics to You've Played Yourself straight off the bat, every word. One thing about the mix is the title. I can't go for that. which a lot of Trapital listeners might say, is Will taking a stupid pill? Why is he naming it after a Hall & Oates song about a bad romance? What's beautiful is, A, I have an incredible remix if I can't go for that. It is a masterpiece of songwriting, that song. But B, the lyrics. You might find this interesting. Hall & Oates did not write I Can't Go For That about a bad romance. They wrote it about their record label and their manager and their agents getting in the way of their creative process. So the lyrics are about believing in your own creative process and pushing back the obstruction and distortion of others. And when I learned that, I was like, that's the name of my mix. I've got the remix on there, but I've got the lyrical meaning of the song. By the way, the same applies to the other Hall & Oates song, Maneater, which again you think is about a bad romance. No, it's about the creative process and being gobbled up by the industry around you. So there's an element of hip-hop culture in those Hall & Oates lyrics that we should pay heed to.
As long as you don't call their music yacht rock, they're good.
I couldn't go for that, Dan. I couldn't go for that.
You could not go for that. All right, Will, thank you as always. Appreciate
Fantastic.
coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching us on YouTube. For more breakdowns like this on the business of entertainment, media, and technology, make sure you like and subscribe to stay up to the latest on any of the insights that we have on Trapital, and make sure that you tell a friend about it as well. That helps continue to make sure that our show reaches the right people. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.